important in 2022, and then talk about why Sage Publishing is organizing it. So like you, we believe that the freedom of expression, the freedom to read, the freedom to learn are essential for a vibrant society. And if you've been following the news, frankly, the threats to academic freedom, to intellectual freedom lately are very concerning. And so, you may have seen here, this will wake you up. It is maybe not the statistics you want to hear first thing in the morning, but it'll wake you up. For example, PEN America, a nonprofit organization that's devoted to academic freedom, recently found that in 2022, just so far, we're still in 2022, 36 states have introduced 137 gag order bills, which restrict discussions of certain topics in the classroom. So that's up from 22 states introducing 54 bills in 2021. So 2021, 54 bills total, and now so far in 2022, we're at 137 bills and counting, and that's amongst 36 states. So it's not just certain pockets of the country. And I think what was even more startling for me to learn was that 39% of those bills target colleges and universities, and that's up 9% from 2021. So we have a real problem here. Just to give you an example, one bill that was signed into law in Florida earlier this year states that a curriculum cannot include concepts such as privileged or oppressed based solely on race, color, sex, or national origin. So that just gives you a flavor of the things we're dealing with. And as the president of the United Faculty of Florida states, this is creating a chilling effect in the classroom. So at SAGE, we are working on a number of efforts to combat this, to overcome these challenges, partnering with groups like ALA. We've joined the United Against Banned Books campaign. It's awesome. I recommend any individual joining it. We're working with the iSchool at the University of Illinois on the Downs Award for Academic Freedom, and we also published the Index on Censorship magazine, and very proudly. SAGE is an independent company. We've been independent since our founding, and our founder recently passed on her shares of the company to guarantee it will be that way indefinitely. And so that means we're really thinking about the long term, because we're not thinking about necessarily short-term shareholder gains. We're thinking about the long term, and we're trying to create lasting partnerships. And so the reason why I mention that is to say that if you all have ideas or projects that you're working on in this space that need some support, and you think SAGE could help, please reach out to me afterwards or send me an email, because I would love to hear what you're doing. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We've Emily Knox, Aisha Heikel, and John Burgess. I'm going to start with Emily, who is not here physically, but is joining us virtually. Emily, there you are. If you could introduce yourself first, and then we'll go to John and Aisha.
Hi, my name is Emily Knox, and I'm an associate professor at the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Good. My name is John Burgess. I'm an assistant professor at the School of Library and Information Studies at the University of Alabama, and I'm very happy to be with you this morning.
Hello, Aisha Heikel. I'm College of Charleston. I'm manager of archival services at the Avery Research Center of History and Culture.
Great. And this is going to be an interactive session. We're going to start off with some pre-prepared questions, and then we'll have the mic passed around like a talk show from the 90s, so you all can ask questions as well. So first question, how have challenges to academic freedom changed in recent years, and what do you think is causing those challenges? And we're going to start off once again with Emily, if you can respond to this one. How have challenges to academic freedom changed, and what's causing those changes?
So I would say challenges to academic freedom actually come up whenever there are major changes in society. So I would say the last time we really saw this sort of legal maneuvers that we're seeing right now really happened in the 50s with the Red Scare. What we're seeing now is really a widening of the culture war. And people wonder, where do my kids learn about certain ideas, and how do these become part of the overall discourse in society? And universities are always a target for that sort of thinking. What's interesting right now is that we're really seeing laws being passed to dictate what people are able to say in the classroom. from pre-K through higher education. So I would say that this is really part of an overall structural shift that we're seeing in our society as a whole.
Thank you. John? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So the only thing that I'd like to add is, in addition to what Emily said very well, is that we also are entering an age where we're increasingly able to disengage with one another in a civic space. The technologies that we use, the means of amusing and informing and even educating ourselves are becoming increasingly atomized. And so the structures in society, which previously have held us together, are no longer in place. So it's so much easier to divide us and then reward us for taking extreme positions. So we're operating in a space where it's harder to come together, and those who do have clear agendas will find it increasingly easy to affect those, since it is very difficult to get people to engage in their communities civically.
Thank you. Any thoughts to add, Aisha?
Yeah, I would concur with all my panelists here. I want to just add that the information is just so much out there that people are having a hard time accessing it and then reviewing it and actually analyzing it critically. A lot of it is coming from different spaces, and people are just absorbing it and not necessarily really taking time to analyze it. I think a lot of it is about producing culture, and we really need to go back to be a creative culture, that people are creating content that is authoritative. I think also the conversation around who's an expert has been challenged, and so that's kind of, we need to kind of interrogate, but then also to listen to people so that they can be heard, but then not to be judged and criticized for their viewpoints too.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for setting the stage for us. So now let's pivot to the role of the librarian, and with kind of a more specific question. And starting with Aisha, how can librarians develop their collections in a way that really champions intellectual freedom?
Well, I think first, make sure you have a policy. I know a lot of librarians do, so that's great. But I think it's best to review that policy with your colleagues, with faculty, with your community, so they actually know what you collect. A lot of it is around fear tactics. And so by dispelling that fear, that you can limit people feeling threatened that their collection or their viewpoint isn't being collected in the library. I think make sure that your collection is getting weeded, on a periodic basis, making sure that the most up-to-date information is in their collections, help to support intellectual freedom, then also making sure that your collections have diverse viewpoints, right? That not just solely Western ideas of thoughts, but it's also including more Eastern your thoughts, things from the global South, even if you can explore that, either your print collection or your digital subscriptions.
Thank you. John?
I think I just concur. I don't really have much to add beyond that. The idea that you said about weeding is incredibly important. Rather than, if you're in an environment where conversations about justice and conversations about representation can't be made directly for legal reasons, then collection development policy recourse that you can really lean on is currency, like you said, accuracy, and broad representation. And so a lot of that will accomplish the same things without necessarily engaging in a direct confrontation, which if you're in confrontation with your administration, you're not going to win that fight. So there are ways to accomplish your goals just by altering what you choose to prioritize.
Thank you. Emily, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I would say that keep in mind that the Intellectual Freedom Manual, which is published by American Library Association, has several best practices for developing collection development policies. I would also add that in any library, but especially thinking about the different types
Recording in progress.
of academic libraries that exist, really keep your mission in mind while we're developing those policies. And you might have different policies for different libraries. So I am here at the University of Illinois. It's the third largest academic library in the country. So we have many different libraries and many different collection development policies depending on which part of the university a particular library is serving. So some services are centralized and some services are not. And each of those services actually needs its own policy that keeps with the mission of the overall university and the library itself. I just want to say for weeding, make sure you have a fully vetted weeding policy. Weeding is where libraries often get into trouble. So be sure that if you are weeding, that you are doing that extremely carefully, that it's not great to have dumpsters in the back. This is what gets a lot of public libraries in trouble, not so much academic libraries, but please have a fully vetted weeding policy.
Great, thank you. All right, next question. So you have a patron who, in some way, either directly or indirectly, is asking or expressing a desire to restrict access to information, learning materials, et cetera. What do you do? How do you support those patrons in those instances? Let's start with you, John.
Yeah, absolutely. So service is a very important value. We've made it a core value, and it's part of our identity as professionals. And so it's very important to serve all patrons, even those whose desire is not to promote access, but to restrict it. And so we've already begun talking about the role of policy. I think it's time to reiterate the role of policy in this instance as well. If we're talking about an explicit challenge in this kind of circumstance, then make sure that the challenge policy is already posted, that everyone knows how to observe it. If we're talking about other issues, make sure that they understand that beyond our collection development policy, we restrict access only on the basis of what is legal and intellectual property. So be prepared to educate and to have avenues to explore in a procedural sense requirements for receiving, transmitting, and evaluating any challenges to materials or teaching materials.
Great, thank you. Aisha?
Yeah, I think this is easier in academic libraries than public libraries, just because of our audience is very much broader, because you have scholarship angle of people. There's a lot of different people on campus that are interested in these histories, and so we can't restrict information just because you don't appreciate it or don't want to hear it. And so make sure that, even though it's not for you, it's still feasible and appropriate for other folk. If you're in a more public library setting or you have more public-facing folk, it can be more challenging because there's the legal issues, the legislation issues that are happening. But it is the same kind of issue of listening what is the main concern of their ban, and then make sure you have a policy for that challenge to go through, for workflow process for people to challenge items. Make sure that people understand that libraries are for everybody, for all people. And so that is kind of how you can lean on that aspect.
Great. Sounds like that policy is really key. We're seeing a theme here. Mm-hmm. Emily, do you have thoughts to add here?
Yeah, I would say that a couple things. First of all, you can no longer assume good faith when somebody is bringing a challenge. This used to be really part of how we understood challenges, that people were going to be supportive of the library, that they would engage in, if not civil discourse, then discourse at all. What we're finding now is that people are not even going through the prescribed channels for bringing challenges, and you must be prepared. I cannot stress that enough. You have to be certain of what you will do when someone brings various types of challenge. Who are people that you can reach out to talk to? This is especially true for public libraries. I would say for academic libraries, in the sort of political atmosphere that we are in now, do not assume that you will not be targets. You also need to be prepared. I am very worried that after the midterms, there will be more state politicians going after public universities, especially to look at collections. Be sure that you know who the attorney is that you can talk to, that you have talked to your staff about intellectual freedom issues, that everybody is fully trained, that your policies are up to date. I do not think that academic libraries will be left out of this particular culture war.
It's very true. Thank you, Emily. So, alongside, these challenges to, yes, no, this is right. Alongside these challenges to academic freedom, we're also seeing, so many challenges related to misinformation and disinformation, where there's intentional leading people to faulty information. And so, we're dealing with both of these things at the same time. How can librarians steer students away from this misinformation while at the same time being, freedom of speech, freedom to learn champions? We'll start with you, Emily, if you have thoughts to share first.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is one of the most difficult things for librarians right now, and I've been thinking about it quite a bit. Understanding how mis and disinformation works is really much more internally focused than it is outwardly focused. So I know that a lot of our information literacy courses talk about what is a good source, but how people understand good sources often comes from their own cultural, political baggage. So I think we need to do much more to address how do people understand information in the first place. I've really been stressing the reference interview as a way of thinking much more about context. So if someone says to you, which I've had someone say to me before in a class, that the New York Times is a liberal rag, right? What are they trying to say to me? How do I actually address that issue? So I know that's not great about misinformation and disinformation, but I think we need a more broad understanding of how these phenomena work, as opposed to simply saying like what is factual, what is truthful. We need to think much more about information as a social phenomenon and not simply just thinking about like what is peer-reviewed and what isn't.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you. Aisha, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, when I was as an archivist, I work with primary sources a lot, and so using primary sources as a way to examine history is important. And Emily mentioned interpretation is very much a part of historical research, but so trying to provide the broad perspective of documents, of images and correspondence, so to kind of counteract some of the history, but it does have to interpretation is going to be there. Confirmation bias is a thing, and so it's kind of balancing the two, but providing the wide scope of information to the people about history is important. Going to Emily about the Socratic method during the reference interview process is very important because it's the asking questions to really get at why people think that of these things, and by doing that, people really analyzing themselves why they see documents or see history that way.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is that while it's important to have this sociological understanding of why people are turning to culture to help them define truth for them, I think it is important to still continue teaching and emphasizing the traditional skills, because while we absolutely do need to unpack why people believe the things that they do, we do at least, I think it's still beneficial to share the kind of ground language of the framework of information literacy, and to essentially educate ourselves on the principles of critical information literacy as well, so that we can better understand the way power and privilege do play into the authority that they use to choose for themselves what is true and what is false. So continue teaching traditional techniques, expand on what Aisha and Emily have said about the sociological aspects of them, and then also understand the critical underpinnings of why people are rewarded for having anti-factual or holding anti-factual positions.
Interesting. That's a lot for a librarian to do.
It's a lot.
But I think the rewards are equally great. So thank you for sharing that. And so I'm going to ask one more question myself before we turn to the audience. So if we can get the mics ready, just ultimately, is there anything that librarians can do to promote a culture of intellectual freedom in an era of extreme polarization? We're 1 week away from the midterms. We're feeling it now more than ever. Aisha, I'm going to start with you. If you can add in some final thoughts here, then we'll go to John and then to Emily.
I think the couple of things librarians can do to promote, the first and foremost is the programming that you all do and the people you bring in for the programs, making sure that they are diverse folk from different religions, sexualities, race, and things like that, so that people get the access and see that the library is for them and that they are accessible. Also, in terms of your if any events programs that you external groups can do programming in your library, making sure that those policies are clear. That has been an issue over the few years about who can have external programming in your library. I think also having clear exhibits, like there was a lot of banned book exhibits the past over a month or so ago, and that is really important because it shows where libraries stand in that position. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the only thing I would like to add is that libraries are and should remain an expression of the public good, of a space where we can work together to accomplish things that individually we couldn't do alone. And so while we can't directly affect the public sphere or the way democracy functions, if we continue to work together collaboratively in a spirit of progress and free speech and the free sharing of ideas, then at least we are preserving one space and demonstrating it functioning well. And so if nothing else from a symbolic standpoint, if we continue to hold true to our values and continue to affect them in the world, there is at least a visible alternative to reduction and division and unfettered self-interest.
Thank you. Okay. Emily?
Yeah, I would say, to build on what my fellow panelists said, is that really libraries need to be much better at advocating and marketing themselves. We often assume that people will like the library, that they know what is being offered, that they will be supportive of the library, but as mentioned, the public sphere is under constant attack. Public goods are under constant attack. So we really need to be much more political and advocate why it is important to have a library, why it is important to have support intellectual freedom in libraries, why they matter. We can't assume that everybody will agree with us when we say that. So I think this is really part of moving forward through these attacks on public goods in general. We need to be much more political and engage in more advocacy.
Great. We just talked about all these amazing things that libraries and librarians can do, but if nobody knows about them, how helpful are they? Great, thank you. All right, questions from you all in the audience. We have some mics and mic passers. I know some of you are experts in this space too, so comments as well if you have other thoughts or resources. Okay, well, I have a question while we wait for you all to think of questions. So resources that librarians can turn to, are there any favorite websites or blogs, podcasts, things that our librarians in the room can read or visit?
This is much less interesting than a blog or a podcast, I'm afraid. And I'm going to beat Emily to it. Consider subscribing to and reading the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy. It is an ALA journal brought to y'all by the Office of Intellectual Freedom, and it is a wonderful mix of scholarly content and reports from the field, including a summary of intellectual freedom and privacy related advocacy efforts in the public. And so Emily, I absolutely stole it from her because she is the managing editor for it. I'm but a mere board member, but I highly encourage y'all to read and enjoy it. It's a wonderful source.
Great. Emily, do you want to add any resources?
Yeah, I'd like to also say that we've opened up the news editing part, not editorials, but the news of every single challenge that is happening. Those have grown by exponentially over the past few years. I just reviewed about 125 pages actually it was 166 pages of news of challenges. Along with that, I would really encourage people, as you mentioned, to join Unite Against Book Bans, to really be involved on the grassroots. So I think that people who know libraries are the best people to be run for school board, run for a library board. When I say get involved, these are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about. There are a lot of resources out there. I would say along with JIFP, there's also, for any of you that read Bookright, Kelly Jensen tracks a lot that's happening. Also, every library tracks things. I'm on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship. We have the Kids' Right to Read project that some people might be interested in. So there are a lot of places in this space, and you can probably find a space that works for you.
Right. Just on the Unite Against Book Bans, that's uniteagainstbookbans.org. I'm looking at you, Deborah. Okay, great. We've got the head of it over here in the audience. And for that, or the Unite Against Book Bans, organizations can join, so SAGE is signed on, but then individuals now can too, as of recently. So go to that website and send your patrons there too if they're interested in this. Aisha, do you want to add any things there? Any resources? Any thoughts? You got them. Great. Anybody in the audience have resources or places they've gone to before?
I did miss one, and that's the Freedom to Read Foundation, which is the legal arm of the American Library Association. And with all of the legal challenges that are happening right now, making sure that we are able to engage in the legal arena is incredibly important.
Great. Okay. Anyone think of questions? Yes, back in the back.
morning. I'm Amy Terrell from Copyright Clearance Center. Thank you so much for this panel. As a non-librarian, what is weeding?
Yeah.
I kind of have a vague idea, but if you could talk a little more about that, that would be helpful.
I
Thank
thought
you.
the same. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and I'm sorry I'm actually proud of myself for not calling it de-accessioning, which would be but basically it is the policy-driven decision-making process for removing collected materials from a library or archive. And so one of the main reasons for it, for doing so, is currency. You want to remove material from your collection that is out of date, and of course things like medical research and scientific research certainly date out much more quickly. Things that older than 5 years in medical research are almost irrelevant, except for historical purposes. But the same can be true for humanities research and social science research as well, as ideas are replaced through systematic inquiry. You want to make sure that your patrons have the most up-to-date information. So that's weeding.
And I can see how the policies there would be super important because we don't want to restrict access to information, but we want the most relevant and up to date. We don't want misinformation, so that's interesting. How many in the audience are librarians? Okay, and how many of you have weeding-related policies? Okay, so maybe about half. And how many of you have policies at all that are related to academic freedom, intellectual freedom? Okay, so even fewer, I see a few of these, okay, that's interesting to see. And we're hearing from this panel that those policies are just key. They'll save you and they'll guide you. So that's an interesting takeaway here. Okay, other questions from the audience? Yes, over here in the middle.
Hi, I'm Natasha Zintu from UT Dallas in Texas. So you talked about having all these different kinds of policies in place. Would you consider it best practice to have these policies separate or to have them all combined into one full policy? Or what would be your best practice on the structure of these different policies?
So these should all be separate policies. I really highly recommend the Intellectual Freedom Manual. The Intellectual Freedom Manual recommends I believe it's six different policies that every library should have. Along with listing these 6 policies, it also talks about how to develop the policies. And it's targeted to different types of libraries. So if you go through the manual, it will say, this is what you should have in a school library, this is what you should have in a public library, this is what you should have in an academic library. So each policy is separate, but they should be presented together. If you are working on developing policies, they should go through committees, they should be vetted by the board, and the Intellectual Freedom Manual discusses how to do that as well.
And this is probably an honest question, but then they're made public, right? The policies are on the website, so you can...
Absolutely. And also the policies should be reviewed on a regular basis, either every 3 to 5 years.
Okay, very interesting. Okay, that's helpful. Any other added thoughts? Yeah.
Yeah, just real quick. So one of the main reasons why you do post your policies publicly is because they're a way of maintaining accountability for them. So a good policy is based on your mission, vision, and values, and in some ways allows you to enact those things as well as defend them. And if nobody knows what your policies are, nobody will know what your values are, and no one can hold you accountable for them. So it's all well and good to have a whole bag full of principles and core values and all those things, but if nobody ever sees them, then you may as well not have them. And the other thing, just to build on what Emily said very well, is that there must be a review process for your policies, because if you are not continually engaging in updating and refining your policies based on assessment of their effectiveness, then it just becomes like reified the thing that we always did, the things that we have always done, instead of here's what we hope to accomplish with our policy. So wonderful question. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you. Any other thoughts, Aisha, on that? Okay, great. So the policies are really putting into practice your mission and vision and your values. They're holding you accountable to them, making it actionable. That's really helpful. Okay. Any further final questions from this group? Okay, I'm going to close out with just one final question for then in the last 4 minutes we have. So we've talked about a lot of things that you can do. We've talked about a lot of ways of teaching students and helping them think in new ways. That all requires time, and you have, a whole bunch of other responsibilities. So how do you make time for this? And not just time, but how do you make headspace for this amongst all the other things you're doing? Whoever wants to go first, feel free to, now that we can see Emily on the screen, feel free to raise your hand. Hi, Aisha.
Yeah, I think setting time, annually, like in the summer, like we can just a little bit downtime, a little bit. We can at least try to, make those time when the new year is coming, new academic year is coming upon us, to really review our policies and to make sure that they are meeting that space and what we need. Even setting a calendar, making like a retreat kind of thing, so it's not like a sad thing to do, but it's actually something exciting and is putting your mission and your purpose forward. John asked me about, does archives have something similar to what libraries do? And normally around accessioning and collection biases is really what we talk about in archives. And so there are a lot of archives around the country reviewing their gaps in their collections and seeing where they can put diverse voices, and also correcting some of the language in our finding aids and other descriptive processes. So there is a lot of that happening in the archive side too, just so you know.
Okay. Emily, do you have any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that these things are actually some of the most important things that a library can do. I know that a lot of times libraries just kind of run, right? There are always people coming in and out, but I'm sure you've noticed that I'm just very concerned, especially with, for example, closing of the public library in Michigan, Patmos, that the board actually voted to close it, and then the town does not want to. We'll see what happens, basically. I don't want us to be in that position. It might be that this is actually what the priority is. I know that, storytelling, other things, but if there's no library, there's no storytelling. So really thinking about what do we need to do to meet this moment is just incredibly important.
Great. John, any final 30-second thoughts?
Your ethics and standing up for your values shouldn't be something that you do separate from everything else. It really is the thing that you should be doing in the moment. That doesn't mean, being heavy. It doesn't mean, being an ethicist. It just means taking the time once to get reacquainted with professional values, why we believe the things that we believe, and how we use them to inform the decisions that we make, so that as you make not the big colossal decisions, but the small everyday decisions, you just include that in part of the decision-making process. So it's iterative, not epical, right? Not monumental.
Great. So it should be at the core of what we do. Yeah, great thought to end on. Well, I want to thank Emily, Aisha, and John. They are experts, so I don't know how much time they have, but come to them. They've got some great expertise to share. So thank you, and thank you all for joining us today.